I wouldn't even call that morals. I'll just call that more a sort of cultural, how would I even say it? Like cultural behaviors.
Yes, but what makes something immoral?
I'd say that's actually, oh my God.
Yeah, I've thought through this already.
Welcome to the I suck. Welcome to the Ask a Psychologist podcast, where we ask various questions to psychologists. With me, I have Aiyana. I forgot your last name. This is not scuffed at all. Could you introduce yourself to anybody watching and tell us about who you are, what you research?
Okay. My name is Aiyana Willard. I research the psychology of religion. Predominantly, I take a cultural evolutionary approach to this. So this is looking at religions as a population level phenomenon. So in this work, I look at how religions form, what causes people to adopt them broadly, so why religions become population phenomenons, and then also how religions affect society. So we're kind of looking at all things: what makes people religious, why these religions spread to groups, why groups hold them, and then how these different types of beliefs affect the groups that have them. So within that, we've looked at all sorts of quite a wide variety of different things. So a lot of the more prominent work is on moralizing and supernatural punishment and how kind of religions enforce normative social behavior and moral behavior, and how this has structured societies. I'm currently looking at innovation in belief and how beliefs are changing to fit with contemporary society. So this is work with spiritual but not religious, and particularly neo-pagan populations, where we're looking at how beliefs are changing as society changes around us. So as new institutions come in, religions tend to be a little bit less prominent in people's lives, and other belief systems take over.
That's great. You've kind of made me think about like this sort of forming religion you said. How do religions form? And because I think a very valid question that many people nowadays have is like, is God Israel? Is God Israel? Does God exist? Do I believe in God? What God do I believe in? And I think one of the best sort of arguments against for the existence of God is that so many people historically all over the world have believed in some sort of deity or deities, and that kind of makes you question whether like all people could just suddenly come up with this concept. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so we are a remarkably religious species. There is no society on the planet that we know of that exists now or has ever existed that has absolutely no religious and supernatural beliefs. So as a species, religion is ubiquitous. Within any society, there are always non-believers and believers. Even societies with really high amounts of religious belief, there's always doubters within a group. Which raises interesting questions about how we think about the world and how we kind of process information that would lead people to religious sorts of beliefs. I think it's a mistake that we make as scientists and people living in like contemporary Western societies to think that we come at the world from a scientific, naturalistic perspective. Most people don't. So when we're looking out at the world and looking at what causes things to happen, why good or bad things happen, what causes natural disasters, what structures our basic existence and gives us meaning, supernatural beliefs are a pretty obvious answer to that. So we have some basic tendencies that come along with just being a social species. So we have really a lot of cognitive architecture around kind of interpreting emotions, interpreting facial expressions, interpreting other people's actions, because it's really important for us as a species. We're not good at anything on our own. We work in groups. So we need all of that stuff. And those bits of our brain get used to interpret all sorts of other things that are not necessarily other people. So we tend to give kind of human-like intentions to a lot of things that happen that otherwise would seem to happen at random. We tend to think of minds and bodies as separate. So when I teach this to my undergraduate class, I often ask them, like, do you think you could swap minds with another person? And, you know, it doesn't really matter what the answer is to that question. The fact that you understand it as a concept is weird. So if I said, if you were to swap, you know, nervous system or or your liver or any of those things. You would just be straightforwardly confused. But what that tells us is that we don't actually think our mind is attached to our body, as a fairly basic rule, right? So you can get there intellectually, people do, but at the baseline concept, we tend to think of ourselves as not part of a physical body, which means that we think of kind of the bit that is you as something separate at a baseline. So that gives a rise to the ability to think about things like ghosts and gods and spirits that exist separate from your body quite easily and quite intuitively. So there is something about how we perceive the world that leads people straightforwardly to supernatural beliefs of all types. That doesn't necessarily get you to a religion. So if you just get a bunch of babies and let them grow up in a world, they may come up with all sorts of reasons why things happen that maybe look like supernatural beliefs as we'd perceive them. No one from infancy with no training is going to get to science automatically. That's a mistake. But you are going to get to all sorts of other supernatural-ish beliefs. Where these things become religious beliefs at a group level is how people share them and how people transmit them between generations and between people. So certain things make things more memorable or make things more transmissible. And those are usually kind of about who is talking to them and how useful the beliefs are. So we follow more prestigious people in a society. We tend to believe the things that they say more readily. Conformity biases are prominent. So if everyone in your society believes something, you will automatically just adopt that belief quite straightforwardly. If you're looking at someone, you want to learn how to be a good hunter in your society where hunting is really important. You might look to the best hunter and try to copy all of the things that they do. But it's really not that clear what makes someone a great hunter. So you may pick all of the things. They have the bow, they eat this food, they do this little ritual before they go. It's not always clear what the actual causal processes are. So we also tend to adopt things in kind of collective. And when we start doing that sort of stuff and those sorts of learning biases, we get beliefs that are held by large groups of people and belief systems that sort of adapt over time to large groups of people, and that is when we have like a full-fledged religion.
That's very interesting. I never really thought of it as that, because I always thought, like, how do you get a bunch of people to follow something that like seems so, well, in some cases outrageous, in some cases it's more believable, but sort of I always thought of kind of how do you start, like in the case of a Bible, if it's a fabrication, how would you write it? How would you get a lot of people to believe in it? But you saying it's not that sort of top-down process, right? Yeah. So Christianity is built on the back of Judaism, which already existed in a world where these types of supernatural beliefs were already quite common. So there's already kind of a worldview system that allowed for those beliefs to flourish, right? And where Christianity, spreads, so it spreads in large Roman cities, really that's where it kind of starts taking off. And it's because it actually potentially was giving benefit to the people who were believing it, right? So the Christians did stuff differently than some of the people around them. They were much more likely to look after the sick and feed people when the plagues came through. They recruited a lot of women because they gave women more social power than they had in some of the other religions of the time. And then they spread that way because then women would teach their children, right? So these are a set of beliefs that kind of had adapted to a large scale social setting. So if you have a bunch of small religions that kind of deal with people's individual, you have a bunch of nomadic people and a bunch of other groups that come together and they have religions that are sort of adapted to that life, and then they're living together in a big city. Some of those beliefs are not that helpful anymore. Christianity became a very helpful belief in those settings and spread quite fastly. So like if a plague comes through and some people are looking after the sick and feeding people and some people aren't, the people who are looking after the sick and feeding people are going to do better and everyone else is going to notice. So then you start getting people that way because it's like, oh, this deity is looking down and actually helping these people. But it might straightforwardly be the actions that people are engaging in. Yeah, it was just the sort of, when you said that, swapping the brain with another person and kind of like trying to copy them and all that, it kind of even makes more sense to me. I never thought of it that way. And sort of with the looking at other people, how they're doing it, that they're living better through doing this and then adapting that. Like I have done that. Like I have looked at people who are better than me at something and I learned from it. I copied them. So I guess that really does explain sort of.
Religions are never top-down architecture. Someone doesn't come up with a belief system and try to impose it on people. That's just not a very successful strategy. They're things that build up over time from the bottom, right? Any population. This is why we see religions everywhere and why they're so diverse, is because people create beliefs all the time, and generally the ones that are at least somewhat beneficial are the ones that survive and become and spread. So if you're doing something that helps you or helps people around you, regardless of whether or not it's a real belief. So it doesn't actually, at least in the system, it doesn't really matter if the thing you believe is true. If it's having a consequence that's beneficial, then it will spread. We also, you can spread very maladaptive bad beliefs as well through mechanisms of transmission quite easily. But a lot of the stuff we see are things that are quite helpful to a society. So one of the things that we've looked at, so we have a kind of the big gods or moralizing gods hypothesis that says that one of the things that happens in these kind of big world religions is there's a change in how there's a few things change in religion. And so you see this kind of most easily in Christianity, where you have this deity that suddenly you have a deity that kind of can see everything, that knows what's going on in your mind, cares about what you do, and punishes you. And the kind of moral systems that get brought in are really about dealing with strangers and other people. So you have that along with the idea that anyone can be a Christian. It's not tied to your ethnicity or your ethnic group. It really allows this group to spread. So you have moral rules that are quite broad. And in a lot of religious systems, kind of smaller religious systems, you see very specific rules. It's like, share this food this way, don't steal this thing from these sorts of people. And instead, within these big world religions, you're getting beliefs that are like, hey, be fair to people. Don't harm people, these kind of broad moral edicts. And that is a kind of an innovation in belief that's built on existing beliefs that allows something like Christianity to spread worldwide. So the first religion that really does this is Buddhism. It kind of takes some of the local beliefs of Hinduism and changes them so that they apply to everyone. And it becomes very adaptable and spreads all over the world. And you have Christianity and Islam and these other religions that follow suit afterwards. But no one architects that. It's just a thing that kind of happens.
You also mentioned the sort of maladaptive or even dangerous beliefs. In sort of modern society, people have quickly become sort of more atheist or agnostic. They've moved away from religion, and a lot of sort of modern prejudices, especially against like LGBTQ people, or a lot of misogyny is fueled by some sort of religious tradition. That's not to say that all religion is bad, but that's to say that some practices in religion are problematic. How do you think we should approach such practices? Because a lot of people, especially fundamentalists, they don't want to kind of look at their books. They don't want to change them because they believe that this is the word of God. This is the righteous word. Do you think that we should abandon such religion? Do you think we should change such religion? How should we approach this?
So I, if you look at, again, we can use Christianity as an example. There are lots of very positive things that Christianity does, and there's lots of very progressive Christian beliefs, and there are lots of very regressive Christian beliefs. It's not the religion itself that does this; it's how people are interpreting it. So within these, these are beliefs that are open for interpretation, and they're constantly changing. There's kind of a core set of beliefs, but how people use those and apply those is changing quite a bit. And it's usually based on other things, not necessarily the religion themselves. So other parts of their environment and political systems that are doing that. So it's not, I would say that these are, religious beliefs are sort of the thing that people hang a lot of these other beliefs on, but it's not straightforward that they're coming directly from those beliefs themselves. But if you're looking at kind of biblical literalism, it's very selective in what people take literally, which is, a common trope that people talk about. It's kind of, there's kind of a level of hypocrisy in there. I mean, one, you're using probably the King James Bible or a later edition of the Bible that has lots of changes and lots of interpretations. So people who are really committed to sort of biblical literalism wouldn't even be able to function all that well in our contemporary society because society itself has changed quite a bit. Where you get, so a lot of these world religions, and Christianity and Islam specifically, were quite progressive at their start. One of the things that religions that survive quite a long time do quite well is they become more conservative. And I don't mean politically conservative, but I mean the kind of, the ways that they're transmitted and the ways that they kind of remain relevant and successful are a bit static. So you're trying to transmit the same sets of belief over time. So you get a system where sometimes society is changing in a different direction than the religious beliefs, and that can cause tension. But there's nothing about religion specifically that requires this type of kind of regressive or that needs to be against these sorts of changes or beliefs or anything like that.
So I used to be homeschooled in a Christian school. I was you mentioned the King James version, and that's kind of what brought this up to me, because that's the version of the Bible that they told us was the right version. Don't read the New International Version. Don't read which other ones are there? I don't even remember. But this also kind of fueled us because I was in this I was young. I started when I was 13, and by the time I was 17, I was really into it. I was actively trying to debunk evolution, figure all this out. What's the truth? Where's all this? And I started doing research, and I kind of hit a brick wall. And after that, I kind of stopped believing in Christianity, because I looked at science and a lot of science, and it just contradicts what I believed. But many people, on the other hand, are doing the opposite. They're looking at science, they're looking at the Bible, and they're saying, well, science is wrong. And this is fueling, especially now, I think, it is fueling a lot of science denial, harmful misinformation. So how would we approach that? Is it the same as in those harmful beliefs, or is it?
So I don't know how to fix this problem, but I can tell you some of the things that I think maybe don't work that we tend to try. So I don't think this is a thing you can logic your way out of. I think that it's a common belief amongst science believers that they've come to all of their opinions logically, and I don't necessarily think that's true. So I'll give you an example. I believe in climate change. I am a strong proponent of environmentalism. I believe that humans are causing a lot of problems and we need to fix that. I understand almost none of the science behind that, but it's a belief that I hold true, right? So I believe that there is science behind it, and I believe that the people have come up with this. But if you ask me directly if I can, do the science myself, understand what people are doing, I can't. I am going on a set of sort of learning principles where I'm looking at people who I think are trustworthy, prestigious, people that I should follow and believe, and I'm believing the things they say. And that is how we learn 99% of everything we believe and know. So it is, even if you are a scientifically minded person and you're really focused on scientific evidence, a huge amount of what you believe is going to be passed through prestige, conformity, all of the kind of learning biases that we see in everywhere else in society. So I think that going at people and saying have you seen the science is not necessarily the right way to change this. You'd need to kind of look at where they're learning this information from, how they're learning it, and sort of address those problems directly. So the reason that people are denying science is not because, a lot of them have spent a lot of time looking at these things and learning these things and figuring out ways to debunk them, generally in a confirmatory way, which is how most people approach most things. So you're looking for evidence to support your beliefs rather than evidence that rejects your beliefs or that disproves your beliefs. But it's a very difficult thing to change people's minds based on sort of logical principles. We're not great at following those arguments. It's a worldview change, right? You need to kind of address the broader problem of what people think are the causal processes. So there's some really interesting research that was done by a colleague of mine who actually works out of Macau University in China. And he was this is a historical project, so he's looking at historical data on rainmaking rituals in China. And he basically was showing that people, they they're doing these for instrumental goals. They believe that they make it rain, right? Doing rain rituals makes it rain. Rain is important. And people were testing them. So they're trying different rituals. Sometimes rituals would go out of favor because they didn't seem to be working, and things would become more prominent because they were. But the reality is there's sort of a random association between doing it, like sometimes it rains. And it's very difficult, even within science, to kind of disentangle those things. We have replication crisis in psychology based on very similar principles, which is only looking for positive evidence and not looking for negative evidence, even though we're trained not to do that. So what he shows is that when this stops being true, when people stop believing in rain rituals and abandon the practice, is not because they disproved it. It's because they stopped believing that rituals impacted the world. Right? It was a complete worldview change where they said, "Oh, this entire system doesn't make sense. We understand how the weather works." Right? So now it wasn't this sort of logical process of being like, maybe these things are ineffective. It was having a better causal system brought in, and a better kind of overarching worldview brought in that changed how people thought about the relationship between weather and human action.
How do I put this? I think I slightly disagree with a couple points you made. Overall, I do agree. And I'm going to take climate change, for example. I think you mentioned that you don't understand the science, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think it's a very reasonable thing to say that I don't fully understand this. I believe it because those people believe it. Because, I mean, for example, we go into a plane, we sit down on a plane. We don't expect to fly the plane. The pilot's going to fly the plane. We trust the pilot knows what he's doing. We don't know how he's doing it, but we just trust the land. So, in a way, we have to accept that some things in life we just cannot understand, and we'll have to kind of trust other people to do. But I think if you're pushing something, a specific belief, especially if it's not very popular, you should probably do some research and you should actually understand it.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'm just saying that's not what most people do.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I think most people, most people will do some very preliminary research on just about anything. Mostly because in our day and age, we don't really have time to do that. We have to go to work. We have to, babysit kids, etc. But I think that, especially if you're really hard on these beliefs, there's a sort of stigma to educate that. And I think as a society should kind of promote that. To kind of what your point is, to sort of build up not a community, an environment that promotes learning, promotes research in the right way. And
absolutely. But what I'm saying is if you're going at something like people's denial of science, and you're trying to tell people, if you're saying like, look at the evidence here, and people are looking at completely different sets of evidence and have different sets of criteria for what is good and bad evidence based on a completely different system of belief, you're not going to make any progress.
That's true.
Right. So that is more my point, right? That you have to kind of understand how people think, how people learn, how people adopt large scale beliefs in the first place, and understand that actually those processes are pretty similar, regardless of whether or not you're coming at this from a scientific worldview or not, right? So I am a scientist. I do actually understand science really well, and there's things like what we're talking about right now that I can give you extremely nuanced perspectives on, but that doesn't really make me an expert in climate change, right? So I'm still at some point relying on the people around me and sort of the group that I'm associating with. And I do very strongly hold that is the right approach, and that they're doing the right thing. But if you're, I think that we tend to see people who have different beliefs from us as just a little bit stupid. And that is really inappropriate, because that is not actually, one, it's not helpful, and it's not necessarily true, right? So just because someone has a very different perspective on how even like basic causal processes work in the world doesn't necessarily mean they're stupid. It means they've been exposed to a whole different set of information and a whole different set of people from you. So we need to kind of take that into account when we try to make these arguments.
I agree, but I think some people are genuinely stupid.
There are individual differences in intelligence. That is true, but I don't think you can make an argument that is straightforwardly that everyone who believes one thing. And I think that is, even when people won't say it, is kind of the perspective a lot of people take, that everyone who believes this is a little bit dumber than everyone who believes this. For example, if you ask people why they left religion, I mean, this is more true in the US than in the UK, where most people kind of just drift out of religion because it's not that strongly socialized. But if you ask people why they leave religion, most people will say, I thought my way out of it. Like there's reasons that I don't believe in religion, and it was like a set of logical principles, and very similar to the story that you told, right? That is most people's answer. If you look at data, the reason that most people leave religion is because of how they were socialized. So the things that happened to them and how much religion they were exposed to as a young child, how much sort of what we call like credibility displays. So how much people around them were kind of credibly displaying their own belief has a huge impact on whether or not someone maintains beliefs as an adult or not. It's the biggest predictor by far of whether or not people are religious as adults. So there does seem to be a disconnect between what people think the process is and what actually has happened. And that isn't to say that people didn't think their way out of religion or didn't come to those things, but the people for whom that option is available are people who've had different socialization experiences when they were young. So how you're kind of brought into religion, how it's presented to you, and sort of the level of commitment and hypocrisy you're exposed to as during your formative years is by an order of magnitude the best predictor of adult religious belief.
And to this point, actually, we've been discussing religion a lot. Do you think, a bit of a sort of controversial question, society would be better with or without religion entirely?
I think it's not a great question. I don't think it's a question we can really answer. So I don't think religion's going away. I think specific religions might disappear, but I don't think we're going to suddenly become a pure society of secular non-believers.
To clarify, like religion as an institution, like not necessarily the belief in God or spiritualism, but like specifically religion, like just institutionalized.
So the institutions play important roles, and religious institutions play important roles in society and have for all of human history, or at least where they have existed. One of the reasons that we see, one of the kind of predominant reasons we see religion declining in Western societies is because other institutions have taken over some of the roles that religion used to play, right? So you can look at everything from like how people are distributing food and wealth, who's looking after the poor, who's looking after the sick. All of those things are now governments. You can also look at the domains in which religion, kind of the beliefs of religion hold sway. So people generally don't think that the weather is caused by religion anymore, at least not at a basic level, because we have better explanations for that. So there is, even among science deniers, there's a huge area of like explanation of the world that used to be the domain of religion that now we have different and other explanations for that seem to be more effective and people adopt. So like the domain of religion has shrank quite a bit. And that is because other sorts of things and beliefs have kind of taken up some of that space. So as people become less likely to end up dead or destitute, and if you're a Christian or an Islamic believer, there was a huge role for your religion in supporting people who were in a bad space. And if that's gone, you see religious decline, right? And so that this is one of the explanations for why like Scandinavian countries in Northern Europe have such sharp decline in religion. There's obviously differences in how people's kind of group identity is tied up in the religious belief has a huge impact as well. But you see religion declining in places that have strong secular institutions. So I think in the case where you have other institutions that take over, religion doesn't necessarily, as an institution, doesn't necessarily need to be there. If those institutions decline, you might see the role of religion changing again, and you might see it becoming straightforwardly beneficial for people again. There's not really good and bad or kind of hard concepts to talk about here, because we can look at like the role and support that religions give to people, kind of giving that, like, is that necessarily good or bad is a hard thing to say. So, for example, religions play a huge role in cooperation and how groups get work together. So a strong, cohesive group is a much better cooperative group. They can do large projects together. Sometimes those large projects are taking over other groups, right? So like the moralization of this is a bit hard, but institutions are important for supporting large groups. And if those institutions are secular, great. If they're religious, that's also works.
And to follow up on the sort of institutionalized, non-institutionalized, what does like religion mean to you? What is the difference between religion, spiritualism, believing that there's a God, believing that there's multiple gods? What kind of defines all these boundaries?
The definition of religion has been debated for thousands of years, and no one has come up with a good answer to this question. So, okay. So, obviously we're approaching this in a scientific fashion, which means we do have to operationalize the concept that we're talking about. Religion as a whole is very difficult to operationalize. We kind of think of it as it's a fuzzy category. So you and I I can give you a set of beliefs and you can be like, that seems like religion, or that doesn't. But drawing clear boundaries is very difficult. So when we're talking about, it's difficult to kind of draw the boundaries that doesn't either exclude things like Buddhism and a lot of small-scale religions, or include things like political movements, or football fandom, right? So the way we look at it is sort of a collection of different types of behaviors that, on average, look at religion. So the things that we're looking at are supernatural beliefs, generally. Ritual behavior tied to those supernatural beliefs, and group level behaviors, right? So we have kind of things that a group of people hold that are supernatural that tend to be supported by ritual behaviors and ritual practices. That is religion. Spiritual beliefs are often tied to religion, but can be, at least in practice, a bit more individualized. So when we see like contemporary spiritual practices, it tends to be a pick and mix belief where people sort of hold to an identity of being spiritual, maybe spiritual but not religious, but holds a lot of different sets of beliefs, and you can kind of pick and choose from a collection that's out there. That is sort of a lot of where religion seems to be going, or belief seems to be going in the Western world, is to these kind of pick and mix spiritual beliefs. Will that eventually coalesce into something that is more closely a religion? We don't know. We could wait and see. There are a lot of things at the edges of that. And when we're talking about big religious institutions, these tend to have hierarchies and top-down control and that kind of stuff. But that tends to be sort of a later process. It's not usually where religions start. They usually start as small group behaviors that are fairly loosely defined. This is how Christianity starts. This is how Islam starts. This is how every world religion starts. It's all a group of people get together, have a set of beliefs that they share, and those kind of build and change into the sort of large institutions, or they die out, or they stay small.
Regarding religious beliefs and religious rules, where do you think morals come from? Because this is a sort of very valid argument that a lot of religious people say, like, where did morals come from? I mean, how do we understand what's right and wrong?
Okay, so I'm gonna upset moral psychologists everywhere with the answers to this question. So there's a kind of a different ways of approaching morality and psychology. There's sort of a universal approach. There are things that are right and wrong, and there's relativistic approaches that are kind of like every group gets to decide what is right and wrong for them. I kind of fall in the middle in a very clearly undefined place where there's things that I think are straightforwardly harmful to groups and helpful to groups, but I tend to be a little bit more towards the relativistic side myself. I think morals come from similar processes that religions come from. They're kind of they're norms that are set up by a group that are agreed by that group as generally helpful or necessary for that group. Around the world, there are huge differences in where people think these come from. So a lot of places, particularly the more religious places, tend to say, or on average, people tend to say that you cannot be moral without believing in God or religion or something. That is less true in more atheistic countries, obviously. But then it's really unclear where people think morals come from when those questions. If you ask atheists, like, where do you think morals come from? What would you answer to that question? It tends to be a sort of like some things are just good and bad. So there isn't really a lot of thought put into it. And I think that's fine, right? Where our morals are coming from, these sort of communal processes and communal beliefs that we've all agreed on. And that is great. That's fine. It's worked for us for the entire existence of our species. There's no need to change. Yeah, it's no reason to change it now.
Yeah. If you will, I think my personal opinion, like one of the simplest answers to this sort of question is, I think about what would I do for myself? Like, what would I want done to myself? Like, I think it's a pretty simple concept that I won't do something to someone that I don't want done to myself. Yeah, so it's like the very simplest way to answer how sort of morals came up with.
It's the golden rule. You see it in almost every religion in some form or another. If I like it if I think that people should, should be free to touch me in public. Would I, and I have no problem with that, would I then impose that on other people? So there's lots of places where that's really, like, you can think of a lot of examples where that's really a gray area, that the things that you straightforwardly like may not be the preferences of other people. We have beliefs about autonomy that kind of contradict this. So most people, at least in Western societies, believe that you should be able to make a lot of your own decisions about these sorts of things. But if you go to places, so I've worked in a lot of different places, there's very different rules about like whether or not you can touch another person at personal space in public, that may make other people uncomfortable. So like, it's a very difficult question, and the norms that we adhere to. So like, I like my personal space because I grew up in a Western country where that's normative and that's acceptable. And I can assume that is true for everyone. But if I go somewhere, I was just in Morocco, and we were staying in Riyadh, which are very nice, and they're run by family. People come up and just put their hand on you and like welcome you in a way that like, it doesn't really make me feel uncomfortable, but it's like immediately like, that's weird. But that's just a different normative system. So it's hard to say like, is that bad? Is that good? Because I just have grown up in a completely different culture. So I can't actually necessarily make a claim of whether or not that's moral.
I wouldn't even call that morals. I'll just call that more a sort of cultural, how would I even say it? Like cultural behaviors.
Yes, but what makes something immoral?
I'd say that's actually, oh my God.
Yeah, I've thought through this already.
I mean, if I had to say what makes something immoral, it would be sort of, if you can define, oh God, I was going to say define what's bad and what's right, but then that kind of...
Just so we're clear, this is another question that people have been arguing about for thousands of years, and no one's come up with a definitive... Lots of people have claimed a definitive answer, but I don't think there is a good definitive answer.
What is immoral?
And like a lot of societies don't necessarily even have these concepts. So when asked, there's some really interesting research done in China about what is sort of the equivalent concept of morality. A lot of the answers people are giving are civility answers, right? So like spitting on the street is a moral action, but like harming someone or murdering someone, that's a legal problem, right? So like, and this comes out of Confucianism, right? And the kind of idea of being a good Confucian gentleman. So it's just like this concept that we're associating with morality is about something slightly different. That's common around the world. People believe very different things because they have grown up in very different normative systems.
That's very interesting. I think it's for you to figure out what moral means, but I think we'll be wrapping this up. It was great having you. If you have any questions you would like me to ask to any other psychologist, please write them down in the comments. And I think that's it. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.